Well, I took my MG out for a drive, and as I was almost home, I heard a quiet pop noise and discovered a noticeable reduction in coolant level. So it seemed like some part of my cooling system had decided to let go. What you're looking at here is me removing the engine cover to try and see if there's anything obvious wrong. Firstly, there's definitely some steam coming from between the banks on that side of the engine, and that's where the thermostat lives. So let's allow it to cool down a bit, then try and have a look through the gap in the intake manifold and see what happens when we run the engine. Yep, that's a good sized leak going on there. Looks like one of the plastic components in the thermostat assembly has failed. Now, to actually do the repair, the intake manifold will need to come off, but if I remove the airbox and intake pipe, that'll give me enough access to these hose clamps to get in and confirm my diagnosis. Of all things, I usually find long nose mole grips are the best way to remove these types of clamps and disconnect the hoses. Then there's a bolt that holds the plastic components in place, which needs to be removed. Bit of a wriggle to get the first one out, and now
that's a hole.
Yep, the plastic pipe has totally blown out one side. We're comparing it here to a brand new one, and the area that's meant to seat into the engine itself doesn't look too clever either. That's almost certainly our culprit, but if I want to change the plastic bodied thermostat as well, as I can't believe it's too far behind in terms of condition, I'm going to need to get in there. This is a fairly involved job for getting at a simple component, but all you can really do is get on with it. I'm going to start with removing the battery to give me a bit more elbow room. The throttle cable gets unclipped from the throttle body and removed out the way. Then there's this fuel hose over this side, plus various electrical connections on the throttle body, as well as a couple of vacuum lines. Which lets me start peeling back the wiring loom to tuck it out the way more. Again, more breather pipes, plus the electrical connectors for the VIS motors on the variable intake manifold. Where the engine loom runs across the rear of the intake, it's secured with a couple of screws that need to come out. Yet another breather pipe gets unplugged, and it's now loose as a single piece, though I'm going to put the screws in place to keep them there for safekeeping. Also, you can see here that this old breather pipe T-piece is so brittle it practically falls apart when I wriggle it. The design of the manifold is a plastic upper onto aluminium lowers, and these bolts secure those parts together, so we'll get those cracked off. With the bolts removed, the upper manifold should just pull off, but there are sealing rings that can make it a little bit recalcitrant, so a plastic wedge can give a bit more freeing off to get it apart. You can see the sealing rings here. Manipulating any pipes that are in the way, the entire upper manifold with the throttle assembly attached can then be removed from the engine and put to one side. A good habit to get into with working on things like this is to stuff something like rags or paper towels into any open ports and so on, so you can't accidentally drop a nut or similar into an inaccessible area and then have to dismantle even further to extract it afterwards. And again, the fasteners I remove get put back in for safekeeping. These breather pipes are removed and kept together, though some glue is going to be needed to repair where that T is cracked. The other end of the fuel line can be unclipped from the slightly fiddly attachment it has into the injector rail. I actually bent the clip doing this, but I was able to straighten it out and reassemble it with the seals for when it put it back in afterwards, and it didn't cause any leaks. This plastic clip securing the loom in place can be removed, and I also unplugged the other fuel line connector at this stage. Then the injectors are each unplugged, though the rear bank ones are a little fiddly. The injector rails are secured to the lower manifolds with these bolts, which I remove next, leaving the injector assemblies just push fitted into the aluminium. The connection to the alternator is removed, followed by the plugs for the coil packs on the front bank, which allows this run of the wiring to be peeled out the way. Now, the injectors can be quite stubborn about coming out of their fitted holes, so some careful leverage is of benefit here. Not trying to go crazy and rip them straight out, rather just add some tension while wriggling them free. The rear bank injectors get the same treatment. With both sets of injectors free, this small hose can be pulled out the way and all 6 injectors removed as one piece, including the link pipe between the front and rear rails. Once again, the open holes are blocked with paper towel and the bolts put back in situ. I'm next going to remove the small coolant hose linking the 2 blanks and the header tank. Also running between the 2 banks is this breather pipe. Now we can unbolt the aluminium lower intakes from the cylinder heads themselves. I think you can replace the thermostat components with these left in place, but removing them makes access easier and also means you can replace the intake gaskets, which are another potential source of leaks. Some of these bolts are a bit tricky to get at, but they're all manageable with some patience and appropriate use of universal joints and extensions. Once the bolts are out, the front bank lower manifold just lifts off. Next up is the rear bank manifold, and that's pretty much an identical process to the front one. There we go, off it comes. Once again, you guessed it, paper towels to block up the inlet ports on the heads. This sensor is unplugged to get the wire out of the way, and we're finally at the point where the thermostat itself can be removed. There's a link pipe from the thermostat body that's secured with these plastic ratcheting clips, which need to be levered apart. Just doing the one on the engine end allows me to get the thermostat free to pull out. And it's definitely looking a bit manky with the effects of that leak. If you remember, the curved pipe we removed at the start had snapped off at the bottom, so the remains of this need to be extracted from the bore in the casting. One job I'm going to do while I'm in here is change the coolant temperature sensor. It seemed to be working just fine, but as it's buried down here, it seems like an opportunity to put a fresh one in. Very simple job, just unscrew the old one and screw in the replacement. And here is the star of the show, a new thermostat assembly. As with all the parts I'm using here, this was purchased from DMGRS, Discount MG Rover Spares, who are a great source of parts for these engines. They start at £40 for an OEM thermostat assembly, but I bought their full £75 kit, which includes all the gaskets, plus has been reinforced with epoxy along the common failure point of the plastic seam. Very simple to fit, the link pipe pushes all the way in. Then you push the thermostat into the hole in the block, before pulling the link pipe back out slightly until it fits into its own hole. The replacement for our destroyed curved pipe goes in next, a push fit again, and make sure the securing holes of these components are lined up with the bolt hole in the block. Now the securing bolt locks the plastic components into place. Make sure the link pipe from the thermostat is centrally located with even gaps each end. Then into those grooves we fit new plastic ratcheting clamps to hold the link pipe in position. A pair of pliers or mole grips helps get the clamps good and tight. The temperature sender gets plugged back in. Then the hoses can be attached to the new components we've fitted and clamped into place. Next it's the gaskets, which luckily come off easily enough, and then a gasket scraper is used to make sure the surface is clean. You shouldn't really reuse these gaskets, as you can see here one is already a bit brittle, which is why I made sure to buy the DMGRS kit, which included new ones. With the surfaces scraped to remove any remnants of the old gaskets, as a last step some cleaner is used to wipe over the mating surfaces. That scraping cleaning process is also done on the faces of the manifolds themselves. Here's our nice new gaskets compared with the old ones. Making sure to remove the paper towel we were using to block up the intake ports, let's confirm they all line up correctly with the inlet bores and coolant passages and bolt holes. Because the joint is made with bolts rather than studs, there's no way to hang the gasket in place while you fit the manifold. So using a couple of the bolts to position it on the manifold, then putting both in place together is a bit easier, at which point all the bolts can be put in finger tight. These bolts are going into the aluminium cylinder head, so it's vital that they're tightened to the correct torque to avoid stripping any threads. The Haynes manual lists the torque values, and a digital torque wrench lets me work to those accurately. Depending on what you're working on, there can be specific patterns for the order in which you tighten fasteners in order to minimise the risk of warping components or otherwise damaging things. In this case, I'm working in an alternating cross pattern from the centre outwards. First to a lower torque, then repeating that to the full torque listed in your manual. Fitting the manifold to the front back is largely a repeat of doing the rear one. As you can see, the process is now that stereotypical one: reassembly is the reverse of removal. Retrieving those bolts we put in place for safekeeping, the fuel rails with the injectors get reinstalled. To seat things like this, you can often do well with either the good old hammer hand or the wooden handle of a decent sized hammer. It's all pretty self-explanatory at this stage, with the bolts back in place and the coolant hose back where it attaches to the manifold halves. Fuel pipe for the front injector rail goes back in, as does the vacuum pipe that links the two banks. Now I know that all this stuff has gone back in without needing to pull the injectors again for access, I can tighten up those bolts. And the injector loom can be plugged back in and the fuel rails connected up. Now at this point we're going to deviate slightly from a straight reassembly, as while that upper intake manifold is off, it's the perfect time to replace the plugs and coil packs, because access behind the rear bank is a bit of a pain. This is a really easy job. Each coil just gets unplugged, then the securing bolt is removed. With that done, a bit of a wriggle lets you pull the coil out. Spark plug is the same on anything else. Unscrew it from the head, old plug out, new plug back in, screw it home and torque it up. A nice new coil follows the nice new plug. Then the securing bolt for the coil is refitted and the coil is plugged back in. All done, and the process is a repeat of that for the other 5. With new plugs and coils fitted, the reassembly process can continue, with the loom running across the front bank being reconnected. I wasn't very impressed with the condition of the small coolant hose running from this corner, so that was replaced with a fresh one at this stage. Now, each of the 6 runners of the aluminium lower intake manifold has a rubber seal where it mates with the upper plastic section. These should be replaced when you've had the 2 halves apart. We'll start with the ones for the rear bank, these large green ones on the outside of the intake. Just a small screwdriver to get enough purchase to pull them off works fine. Giving everything a nice quick clean and removing the paper towel bungs we put in at the start, you'll notice there aren't any green seals on the runners on the front bank. That's because those are on the plastic section of the intake. New sealing rubbers get fitted to those 3 machine grooves, and then if we grab the upper intake manifold and flip it back over, we can do the other 3. These are a different design, pushed into grooves in the mating surface, and just pull out. Here's one of the new ones. You can see it has a little spur on it that aligns with a slot in the manifold, and it pushes into the groove. A couple more like that, and the seals are done. Before the upper intake manifold is refitted, these breather pipes all need to go back into place. As we saw, one of the plastic T's was snapped, but I'll glue that back together later. Some of the breather pipes fit between gaps in the upper manifold assembly, so those get checked to make sure they can go where they need to go as the upper manifold is put roughly in place. With that confirmed, the plastic upper half of the manifold can be pushed home onto the aluminium lowers, and the bolts put back in. Time to get some breather pipes and electrical connections put back together. Got to remember to reattach the wiring where it's mounted along the rear of the manifold, and then we can reattach the throttle cable. With the last breather pipe into its push-fit connector, the bolts between the upper and lower manifolds are tightened up. The battery goes back in, and provided I've not messed anything up, the car should start. There we go. I'm pretty certain a gunked up cooling system wasn't doing the car any favours, so I'm going to give it a good flushing out. There's a bleed port on the radiator hose that needs to be unscrewed, and I also disconnected this small coolant pipe and switched the heater to full heat to get flow through the matrix. Then some coolant flush is added along with topping up with plain water, and the engine kept running. Once coolant starts coming out the bleed hole, the bung is screwed back in, and similarly that small upper pipe is checked to make sure it's getting coolant flow, which also gives you a brief glimpse of how nasty the coolant in the car actually is. A bit more water to keep the level up, and then the car is run to get it up to temperature and circulate the flushing solution throughout the cooling system. Once the temperature is up a bit, it's being run without the cap on the header tank so as not to pressurise the system, the engine is stopped and left to cool a little, then the bottom hose has the clamp removed and the system drained from here into a bucket. As you can see, it's an absolutely foul colour. I think the car had previously been run with just straight water, and that's probably not been doing it any good whatsoever. Next, I unclamped the top radiator hose and also removed the bleed port screw. Going under the car, there is a drain plug for the water jacket on the front of the block, which can be removed, though access is a little bit fiddly. Now, with drain pans under the car to collect the water, I can flush the radiator and cooling system with fresh water until what's coming out is reasonably clear. As a side note, one thing I also replaced was the header tank cap, which isn't the same as the 4-cylinder cars. It's unique to the 180, so make sure you buy the right one if you're replacing it. So, with everything closed back up, all that's left to do is refill the system with the correct coolant and bleed the system as I did when filling it up for being flushed. After which the car's pretty much ready to be put back into use. I hope that's been useful to you if you need to do a thermostat replacement on a KV6 engine car, and if you'd like to see more of the work I've been doing on my MG ZS 180, please subscribe to the channel, and I'll be back again shortly with another video.